The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowsky, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada on Reality Radio 101. Get ready to talk or post a message to us. We are looking forward to speaking with you. And now, right to your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowsky.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be back with you today and hope that we'll have a very interesting conversation. We have a great guest today, and I understand from our producer, Gary, that in fact we've had up to 1,000 people listening live, so we're growing every month after month, and that tells me a little bit about the importance of this topic, and I'm really glad that we can talk to all of you about these important issues. As I've said before, I have found that the most profound changes occur when a person truly feels heard and understood, and I like to think of it as deeply bearing witness to life evolving. We can feel incredibly stuck when we live with our fears, stressors, and troubles alone. But when we share dialogue and feel supported, it provides a very powerful foundation for us to move forward in understanding and care. Isn't it time for your evolution? So today what I want to do is hopefully have an opportunity to hear what our guest has to say. But also I want to encourage you that if you have any questions or if you want to make a comment or talk about something that we're addressing during our conversation, I'll be tracking those questions as the show is going on, and you can email us directly at instudio101@gmail.com, and hopefully we can have a very lively conversation. So today what I want to do is tell you a little bit about our guest, who is Dr. Robert T. Muller. He's a psychologist, author, and prof at York University with a deep knowledge and understanding of how to help people who've experienced trauma. And personally, I think the really special thing about Dr. Muller is that he has a really profound understanding of how difficult it is to open up after you've experienced something very difficult, very traumatic. And he's written a book. Actually, he's written more than one book. But the book that I want to address today is the book that I have in front of me, which is The Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up from Avoidance to Recovery and Growth. And I've been reading through it, and I've found that the book is quite sweet in a lot of ways, because it really addresses life events and, facing them with a lot of sensitivity and wisdom. There's a lot of client stories of growth and really what looks like to me how they courageously got there with the help of very sensitive and skilled therapists. So now I want to say hello to you, Dr. Muller, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Anna. How are you doing? Good to talk. I'm so excited.
Good. I'm so glad that we are getting a chance to do this. This is just terrific. So, I've been reading your book, and I told you this before, that I found it quite sweet and touching. And I think a lot of what really touches me as I'm reading the book is that, well, first of all, you very courageously write about your own personal story, and I find that to be, in itself, like very touching, because I understand from your book that you have your own personal family history that led you to, I guess, become interested and understand relational trauma. And I wonder if we can start with you telling a little bit about this history and how it's shaped you to understand trauma and dedicate so much of your work to trauma-informed care.
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to, for sure. Let me just, the one thing I wanted to just pick up on what you said was, you mentioned courageous a couple times, and trauma therapy is really tough. It's really hard for people to do. It takes a lot of courage, and sometimes people don't know that they have it in them. And so part of the work is helping people find the courage within them that's already there. And again, I mean that may sound, in a sense, it's easier said than done. It's actually a really challenging thing. But when we see people move through trauma treatment, the only word I can think of is courageous. It's facing some really tough stuff. Yeah. So thank you for using that word, because I think it's very apt. In terms of my own personal history, yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Okay, now before you get into that, because you just said this, I actually think it's very true. I think that doing one's own personal trauma work, like as a client or as a person who's trying to navigate a trauma history, I think of it actually kind of as warrior's work. And then I also kind of see that for the clinician, there is a great need to care for yourself with a lot of sensitivity to your own needs. I don't think anybody should go into helping trauma survivors, let's say, unless they have really committed to care for themselves equally and adequately. But I do look at this as actually warrior's work, like the client, the person who's facing their trauma.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and when you talk about therapists who do the work, for sure, you really need to have, if not your own therapist that you go to, if you do trauma work as a therapist, having a peer supervision group. I have a group who I meet with every couple of weeks at Mount Sinai Hospital, and it's peer supervision, and we're all therapists, and we all talk about our cases and support each other. And boy, if I didn't have that, I just don't know what I'd do. It's very not just draining work, but it's also you really need fresh ideas when you're doing work like this. So it's very helpful to have that.
Yeah, definitely. So we were going to go back to your own.
Oh yeah.
Your own story and how that has shaped you, because you have really taken on this work, and I know you dedicate your teaching, your writing, and your clinic work a lot to trauma care.
Yeah, for sure.
So you have your own history.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was, I didn't really So I've had various difficulties in my life, that I could speak about, that I think, in a small way influenced me, and I sort of thought that those were the things that really influenced me to go into this field. But no, I think in my early 40s I realized that really, really what influenced me more than anything is my family history. And so I'm Jewish, and my parents were children during the Holocaust. And my mother was about 7, and my father was about 10. And my father's father was taken away, and he was killed. My father's father was killed, and my father grew up, in a sense, having to become the man of the house, kind of at age 10, 11. He literally had to go out and get a job, and he learned a trade to become an upholsterer, and grew up in a home where they were very poor, and really struggled under communist rule in Hungary. My mother herself also was a child during the Holocaust, and she has many stories about how there were so many close calls. She was 7 years old, and there were several situations. She was hidden by a Christian family who took it upon themselves to hide her and took huge risks. I mean, if they would have been caught, they would have been killed. But they took huge risks to take care of my mom, and there were several really close calls. And she talks about several times in her life where she, at age 7, was convinced that she was going to be killed. So to go through that really does a number on you. And in particular, my parents, I feel that in many ways they lost the opportunity to be children. I mean, they found the opportunity in other ways, but it was still very hard for them to lose some of that innocence of childhood. You know, that idea, like no one really as a young kid should ever have to think, I'm going to be killed. And when you've had that at a young age, that really does affect you. And so I think that's had the biggest impact on me, having kind of me growing up with parents who struggled about what it means to be a child and really kind of didn't know. And it kind of developed where I think they kind of landed in a great place around that as grandparents. I think my father in particular, as a grandfather, was really different than he was as a father. He couldn't be playful when I was a kid, but as a grandfather, he kind of saw me be playful with my kids and my brothers, and he kind of took it upon himself to challenge himself, but it was not easy. And I think that loss and that history of family trauma or historical trauma, the trauma of my people in many ways, that and my family, that I think has had a big impact on me and kind of brought me into trauma work. And then also one more thing about that is stories people tell about trauma. A big theme in my new book is the idea of how do people tell their trauma stories, which is no easy task for many people. In my family, I grew up with a lot of stories about the Holocaust, but many of my friends and in my extended family in Hungary, they never talked about any of these things. I mean, it was just like, you never talk about it. And so that kind of idea of, do you talk about your stories or not? Do you share them with your children or not? That was something that really I got influenced by really from a young age.
Wow, that is very, very deep stuff. But what I'm really struck with, Robert, is when you speak about it, you seem to speak with such an understanding. It's like these things have integrated for you in some way, so that you can face it and make sense of it, and make use of it as well. So that, like I said at the beginning of the radio show, you become your own evolution. So you've moved yourself forward so that not only have you faced this history, but it seems like you've been able to take it to a place where you have given yourself and the world around you an opportunity to grow through this lens in a way, this depth of understanding that you only would have had with this kind of history.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I for sure have worked at it. I will also say I had a very good therapist.
Well, that's always helpful. Absolutely.
I went for therapy. I actually had 4 years of therapy, really in my as a graduate student, and although we didn't focus specifically on this exact stuff, the themes were the same. It was many of these themes for my family were issues we talked about a lot, and it was a struggle for me for a while. But that experience of going through therapy with a really good therapist who challenged me, who paid attention, was patient, but definitely challenged me. That was good. That was a good experience.
Wow.
It was growthful.
Yeah. Sometimes we cannot see ourselves. We only see what we know. We have a lot of blind spots. So I also really think, having a challenging but compassionate clinician to work with you. A trauma-informed clinician can be very, very important in terms of growth and development. Here we've got a email from Dennis, who says, "Hi, Dr. Anna. Thank you for your show today. A very serious and touching topic to so many people regarding your guest, that is Dr. Robert T. Muller. Can we get any of his resource materials? Thank you very much." So absolutely. Robert, do you want to say how people can access either your website or materials? I'll just read the name of the book again so people can purchase it if they want to. It's The Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up from Avoidance to Recovery and Growth by Robert T. Muller. And just also to remember that Robert has more than one book, and that this radio show will be posted eventually. We're working on our podcast now. So, Robert, do you want to address that?
Sure, yeah. So probably the best way is to Google my name, Robert T. Muller, Muller, and the book that you mentioned just now, Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, that's available on Amazon. My first book, Trauma and the Avoidant Client, is also available, same place. So I have an author page on Amazon. That's one way. The other thing you can do is if you Google my full name, again with the middle initial, and with YouTube, so Robert T. Muller YouTube, you'll get 9 of the videos that I've done so far. These are all podcasts or radio shows. And I was interviewed on the CBC and Global News and some other places, and they're useful interviews because I talk about a variety of different issues that relate to trauma, like post-traumatic growth, family secrecy, bullying, etc. So there are a bunch of different, a variety of different issues, avoidance in trauma, that sort of thing. So that's another way. And the final way that you might want to find me is I have an expert blog on Psychology Today. So the name of the blog is Talking About Trauma. And so every week or two I post articles that are, interesting topics related to the issue of trauma.
Nice. Okay, so that sounds like you've got a lot going on and a lot of resources that could help people. So that's fantastic. Just to remind people, if you want to send an email or add to the conversation, share something, ask a question, it's instudio101@gmail.com. And so I also wanted to know, your book, it largely focuses on trauma that come directly from relationships, and maybe you could help people to understand what makes us different from other forms of trauma, like a motor vehicle accident or natural disaster. I think it's a little confusing what it is about relationships specifically. I mean, I recognize it really is so profoundly different. I mean, what I see in my practice when somebody comes in with a human related trauma. So maybe you can share about that.
Yeah, it is different. I mean, there are some overlapping issues, as you could expect. The idea of being totally overwhelmed by a life experience, that can feel a little bit similar. But there are a lot of differences. So when you have interpersonal trauma, so trauma from somebody who you had a relationship with, whether it's domestic violence or whether it's witnessing violence to somebody you love, let's say, or if you've struggled with being assaulted or raped, or if you were sexually abused or physically abused as a child, those are all examples where an important trust has been violated. And the feeling that goes along with that very often is betrayal. And betrayal is a tough feeling. It turns out that even servicemen and women who've gone to, on studies on Gulf War, men and women in uniform, or people who came back from Vietnam, they also experienced betrayal trauma. The betrayal for them was this idea that they trusted their country to tell them that they were doing something that was important, And sometimes people feel they did, but very often, many of the servicemen and women who come back with PTSD feel like they were duped. Their country lied to them, or, they went for a war, let's say, that why did I do this? What was the purpose of this? This was dumb. This was, I participated in various harm to others and or witnessed harm to others, and at the end of the day, what good did it do? So when people feel that sense and feel betrayal by their country, again, that's betrayal, and it's a tough feeling. The other feeling that's a big one is the feeling of abandonment. When people have been through interpersonal trauma, they sometimes feel that this other person has kind of abandoned the relationship. And I don't necessarily mean just, they've run away from the relationship. I mean, there's a sense of, the things that you believed about it, the other person abandoned those values. The person, maybe, you believed that the person was going to be one way, and then everything you imagined is gone about the relationship. It turns out to be so different than what you thought it would be. So, those two feelings, betrayal, abandonment, those are biggies in violation of trust. Those are really big in interpersonal trauma. I'd say that would be the one of the big differences.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So it's like it hits very deeply. Betrayal and abandonment. These are things that are not easily shaken off. You have a physical injury in a motor vehicle accident. There was a misstep. You went skiing. You had a bad accident, or something happened that really was nobody's fault. Nobody was to blame. It was an unfortunate event, and then you recover. But these kinds of betrayals, they're the ones that nobody can really see on the outside, but they hit us so deeply on the inside, and there's no shaking it off easily. I was kind of struck in a way. I had a conversation. I just happened to be at a travel clinic on Tuesday night, and I was talking with the travel clinic doctor who's done a lot of traveling throughout the world and understands, the impact of life in many, many different cultures. And we were talking about, the differences of the North American culture, where we are really so much alone and on our own and expected to be, an island. And, basically we don't live very, culturally, communally. We're not as integrated with each other, with our neighbors, with our community in general. And this doctor was saying that he really sees, how differently, cultures where they have an embedded way of surrounding themselves with communities and carrying trauma as a community rather than as an individual experience. So yes, something terrible and impactful may happen, but if we can find a way to integrate that with those around us, I think the experience of betrayal, abandonment, the loneliness, the deep loneliness that I hear and see from so many people that I've seen who experience trauma, that seems to be so woven into the betrayal and abandonment. It seems to me that we have to approach our human community in a very different way. Now I'm going to just
let me can I brief comment on that?
Yeah.
I'll just say that there's a really interesting book by New York Times writer Sebastian Junger called Tribe.
Yes, absolutely. I just wrote that down as just before you said it, because I was thinking his book is absolutely the book that I end up recommending to people when I want them to think about things through that lens. It is a fantastic book. Yeah, what stood out for you in the Tribe book?
Well, the overall theme is excellent, and I really love the way he presented various stories. But the idea of, exactly what you said, echoing that when people have been through terrible life experiences, if they have their peeps, their tribe, their people that they can go to, the social support is the buzzword in the field of psychology. If people have that, it offers them so much, and of course, when people are very alone in sitting with their traumatic experiences, it's so much harder to recover. I don't want to make people feel bad. I just think that that's that's an aspect of the difficulty. The self-isolation can be very, very hard, and so finding a way, whether it's a therapist or whether it's a group of people, this is 12-step programs have varying success, but one thing that they do well is social support. I mean, they do really provide a sense of community to people who have been through substantial really bad life experiences, and that's a very important aspect of recovery.
Yes, I've actually heard that from some clients that I've worked with, that when they do end up engaged in some kind of group-based program, they find that for the first time people are understanding them. They don't feel quite as ashamed or alone. And I know you are aware of the charity that we are running, the trauma practice. And one of our goals, the mission, is to ensure that we have group-based programs to help reduce stigma and engage people and help them to understand that, you can connect and you're not alone. And I know from some of the clinicians that are running the group that they're having some really beautiful conversations with the people who are attending the program, who are feeling like they're not quite so alone right now. And to me, that is just so very, very heartwarming. I want to read this email that I just got from Cody, who says, this is such a touching topic, and says that's so sad about Dr. Muller's family history during the Holocaust. That life trauma is never ending. Thanks for talking about this. I agree. I think it's beautiful that you speak so candidly about it, Robert, and I feel really grateful that you were able to do this. I'm also going to read this one as well. Hi, Anna. I'm curious to hear Dr. Muller speak about emotional abuse as trauma, especially with regard to parent figures, as this becomes an attachment thing. He spoke about betrayal by country. So can you address that, Robert?
Yeah, for sure. Emotional abuse, it's interesting. It's the form of abuse that's often ignored. And interestingly, there's some very good research by this psychologist whose last name is Trocme, Trocme, and it's a couple of big surveys and other sorts of large-scale studies across Canada, and he found that what he referred to in the article as psychological abuse to be as impactful in terms of its consequences on mental health as physical abuse or sexual abuse. So it turns out, and this was a very well conducted study, and it was very large scale. I don't remember the exact year it was done, but it was in the last 10 years. Very good study, and that matches my experience as well in terms of working with clients. That many people, they struggle and they say, my parents didn't molest me. They didn't, they didn't beat me up. They were, but and then they tell you and so then they wonder why am I having such a hard time? But then when you actually listen to their story, there's chronic invalidation. There's tons of criticism. There's a sense of the person feeling like they, weren't really wanted. Those kinds of emotional abuse experiences can actually be as damaging to people as it can affect people as powerfully as some of the more better known forms of abuse, physical abuse or sexual abuse. So it's something to really really remember when people have been through a lot, and then they wonder why am I like do I have sometimes people say, do I have the right, do I deserve to complain? And I say to them, gosh, different people have different kinds of trauma experiences, and we can't sit here in judgment and say your trauma doesn't count. I think if someone has been through a lot of emotional pain, we need to take that seriously.
Definitely. I really like Dr. Janice Webb's work on childhood emotional neglect. She's written a few books as well, and they're absolutely excellent and a really, really good resource for people who have that kind of historical trauma. And from this listener, She says, especially with regard to parent figures, as this becomes an attachment thing. And, I think it's really true that when we're exposed to this early experience, it gets very embedded and it becomes kind of thematic in our lives. We are left with certain belief systems that may no longer be true, but every time we try to relax, they come bursting up through to the forefront, and we struggle with this interior languaging that can become very, very devastating. So here's another email that just came in, and this is from George. Hi, George. Hi, Dr. Baranowsky. Absolutely love your radio show. Monthly listener. A question for Dr. Muller. Does he ever do any live talk seminars for the public? If so, where can we find his talk schedule? Oh, Robert, we're going to have to work on that, aren't we? That's excellent. Yeah. Do you want to talk about when you're speaking or what you're speaking about?
For sure, absolutely. I'm very happy to. So on my York University website, so if you just type my name and write York University, at the very bottom it says upcoming seminars, I think it says. And so some of those I haven't fully updated it, but there's one in Toronto. Now it's for therapists. It's called The Relationship is Your Most Powerful Tool and Biggest Pitfall: Relational Strategies for Working with Challenging Trauma Clients. So it's
I've got a question for you then.
Yeah.
Do you think maybe we should work on something so that you can collaborate with the traumapractice.org and see maybe if you could do something for the public? Because I think there might be a large number of people who would find what you have to say very beneficial, particularly in a more public forum.
I think that's a great idea.
Okay, well, why don't we talk about that back channel? So
I would be very happy to do that. That's a good idea. Yeah, I guess that's true. A lot of my talks have been traditionally for therapists. Some of the radio, I've been doing some radio shows and podcasts. If you go for the fellow who wrote the email, I think it was a guy who wrote the email. If you go to my YouTube playlist, you'll find all those different talks that I've given on. So there are, in addition to interviews, there are a bunch of podcasts. So you'll be able to find those, and I'm going to have a few more actually in the next little while. I did a podcast for Therapist Uncensored, and that's quite an interesting one for the general public as well, not just for therapists.
Perfect.
And so those will all. So as those happen, I will put those up. And I also have a list of podcasts on I also have another website called psychotherapytoronto.ca. One word, psychotherapytoronto.ca. And there I have a list of videos and podcasts, so you'll be able to get some information, or not just information, but actually some different talks there as well.
Beautiful. So if you're interested in continuing the conversation with Dr. Robert T. Muller and myself, do feel free to email us if you have any questions or thoughts. In studio101@gmail.com. And I'm also, curious about a particular example you gave in your book about a woman you called Maggie. I know that's not her real name,
right.
So I hope you know who I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, she spoke very, very little during the early stages of the therapy with you, and I wonder if you could explain what happened to help her turn around, maybe a little bit about her story and what helped her to turn around and to heal. Like, what was it that happened in the therapy? What did you see? What did you do? What did she do to turn things around?
Absolutely. So Maggie had been sexually abused by her brother when she was a young woman. I mean, she was a teenager, and it had a strong impact on her. It was very violent, and he was very, very disturbed. Her brother, he ended up eventually actually getting killed in engaging in criminal activity. And so, and her family was not supportive, and that was a big thing about her, was that she had very little support from her parents. She was blamed for the abuse. People didn't take her seriously. That she, and treated her very badly as a result of that. I mean, people in her family, that is to say. So when she came in to see me originally, she was very quiet. In fact, she hardly said a word, and it was difficult work waiting. Sometimes we try as therapists to fill the silence with words, and sometimes that's okay for a little bit. But at the end of the day, some people are just not ready, and yet, interestingly, she kept coming. It wasn't like she wasn't ready and was like, okay, I've had enough of this. Not at all. She kept showing up and hardly saying anything, and I did a lot of waiting. And then at some point, interestingly, she emails me out of the blue. This is several years ago. She emails me out of the blue. I'm walking home. I remember where I was. I was in a underground parking lot, coming home from one of my daughter's theater performances. And I was just checking my email on the way to my car, and I see this email from her, and it says, "I have something to tell you," in the subject heading. And then she goes into this detailed story, words and stories that she would never have been able to say in session, but in written form, in the anonymity of her, of her own home, and not with me not there with her, she was able to write this detailed story. Now, this detailed story was not the end of the story. It's not like in therapy when you tell all the details of your life history, you're all of a sudden better. Therapy is much more complicated than that. What the therapist has to do is to help the person take their story and make sense of it. What does this mean about me? What does this make me feel? How is this scary for me? How is this part of my story an important part of my identity? That sort of thing, kind of really unpacking it with them. But of course, when she came to the next session, it's not like she all of a sudden could chit-chat with me. Not at all. She was just as quiet as before. But her emails kept coming, and the story started to open up. She started to open up slowly as I exercised patience, as I sat with her, as I noted with her that I can see she's emailing me. These are really important. I would tell her, I'm reading your emails. They're really important. Anytime you want to talk a little bit about it, I'd be happy to. And it took a few months. I mean, it did. It wasn't like this was fast. But in time, she did start to open up. The patience, I had to be very patient with her, and we started unpacking things. And boy, once she did, she really did. I mean, she really moved into this place of trying to figure out, what was going on in her life, and an important piece, kind of a take-home piece around trauma treatment here, is the idea of pacing. That in trauma, it's really important to pace the process of opening up, where the person first has to really feel safe and contained. They need to feel that you're providing them a space that feels like it's holding them and in a secure way. And then once they start to feel a little bit more able to feel safe with you and safe in their everyday life, that's when they can start unpacking their history.
That is just beautiful. And I love that you say this. Just telling the story is not enough. There's more work that needs to be done, and it has to happen in the right context with the right holding capacity. And so, taking your time and not expecting to have a kind of rapid turnover, but like peeling back the layers in a really respectful way, in a way that allows for, healing to happen without being jarring and, in itself. Like for some people, actually therapy can actually be very devastating experience. And, we have a great responsibility as clinicians to ensure that, we move slowly, So I really like that you say, just telling the story is not going to be enough. I mean, we can go over the story over and over and over the story, and, we won't necessarily progress. But the other piece about what you said that I find very important is this whole idea that this woman had experienced some pretty terrible things. And, it seems to me that, there's a great intelligence in children. When they learn to be silent, it's often because they've learned that their safety depends on it. So she comes to you and she remains silent, and she's like testing you, and you kind of were able to navigate the course with her because it finally became safe enough for her. It's not that the child isn't hungry, that innocent child that was so wounded. She was probably hungry for, connection in a place where she could finally unpackage this stuff, but she was smart enough to know that until she found the right person, she wasn't going to open up that box, and she tested you. So it's kind of a beautiful story.
Yeah, I mean that's so well said, and so that silence and secrecy even can really be adaptive. It can really be a way that people, have learned to survive in homes where, expressing your feelings are met with the response, "Oh, I'll give you something to cry about," that kind of thing. Well, you learn pretty fast, don't cry, and don't even get sad, and don't, stuff it, and, don't express your feelings, because you're gonna get punished. And so silence can be a really good coping strategy. And I agree with you. She learned that coping strategy well. It takes a long time to learn, healthier in a sense coping strategies. But if silence is what you have and secrecy, then that's what people will do until it feels safe enough to do something different.
Absolutely. Here's another person who's just emailed, John. Hi, thank you so much for emailing us. He says, "Hi, doctors, a new listener here. These issues are so prominent in so many people's lives, yet so many folks do not talk about them." Oh, my screen just went blank. I wish I could get all of the people in the world that are going through these issues to listen to your radio show right now. Thank you. Well, that's a very nice thing to say, John. Thank you very much for writing in. It's really good to hear that this kind of conversation is meaningful and useful. And this is from Justin. Hi, Justin. Justin says, "Wow, this is an incredible story of that patient who was quiet in her sessions." And Justin says, "I went through that. I found that it was easier to write about my experiences than to talk about them, at least at first. Is that a normal behavior for people? I still write about my issues, and it's a relief for me." Oh, that's remarkable.
Great.
Do you want to speak about that, Robert?
Yeah. There are different paths to healing. This is something that we are really discovering in the trauma field. Some people aren't big talkers, but writing can feel better for them. And so, if you as a therapist, if you're working as a therapist and are willing to be flexible, it's sometimes really helpful to ask people to write about parts of their experiences, and to do it that way, because it might be easier than to just, blurt it out in a sense. It's asking a lot of people to just sort of be able to say it out loud in front of another person. So that's a very, very good strategy. Journaling is very helpful. But you know what? There are other paths to healing too. Some of my clients have trouble putting things into words, written or verbal. And so I sometimes get them to draw pictures and to say, okay, you have a sense of it feeling like this in your body. Draw it out for me. Draw me a picture about this. And some of my clients, they respond to me with some pictures, and I ask them, well, what is that? What are the feelings that come up for you as you imagine this? And then they're able to come up with certain feelings as well as aspects of the story, but the visual imagery is what really speaks to them. So there are different paths to healing, and that's totally fine to use writing.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned something about, I guess, using drawing or art therapy or whatever. I think there really is something very important about that, because sometimes the trauma can be pre-verbal. We don't have the words. We can't, form a cogent narrative about what has happened to us. So being able to have an outlet that doesn't require us to, talk about the story or write about the story can actually be very important, at least as a starting place for people when maybe when the trauma happened, when you were even, too early to speak about what's happening. So you wouldn't necessarily have a very strong narrative story about it. You may have pictures in your mind or feelings in your body.
Yeah, for sure. That's very good. That's true. I agree. Yeah.
And also in the work that I do, similarly to yours, I see a lot of people who they want to just bypass the emotional pain of their story rather than work through it, accept it and integrate it, kind of the work that you're writing about in your book, Robert. And I've really reflected to some degree on the cultural demand for us to be like happy and, to kind of bypass, emotional burdens, to, kind of act as if, just repeating happy thoughts or positive things or gratitude is going to be enough. And it's not enough. And I really want to say that strongly because, I think for some people, not only is it not enough, but it could be a terrible burden to, as one client said to me, well, my boss just looked at me and said, just smile, keep smiling, be happy. And it was just very clear that this was a very hurtful thing for this person to hear, and absolutely not what they needed to hear.
Right.
That it was just the need of the employer to themselves, kind of not have to face the fact that, they had an employee who was suffering, and that does happen sometimes. And sometimes we need to kind of recognize and acknowledge that, there are moments when we will be sitting with pain, and playing that happy game can actually make us feel even worse. It can actually make a person feel suicidal.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that many people have is, what's wrong with me? I should be happy. And there's something, so here I am, I'm whining, I'm, I don't deserve to talk about this, I'm just a big complainer. That kind of idea, that's something many clients come into therapy with. And sometimes I talk about this in the book, in the chapter on forgiveness. I have nothing against forgiveness. I think when it comes from an honest place, when it comes from a place of having done a lot of work, and when when the person who's transgressed has apologized or taken responsibility or shown remorse, then it can be a very good experience, kind of mutual forgiveness over some sort of transgression. But when people feel a sense of guilt, like I should be forgiving, what's wrong with me? I have no place in my heart to forgive. I'm the problem. It's my fault. Then that idea is just like you. I mean, it's just so hurtful to people, because when you've been through trauma, you don't necessarily feel all that, and nor should you feel all that forgiving. I mean, you've especially if there's been betrayal, and especially if someone has violated your body, or even emotional abuse, told you things like, I wish you were never born. Those kinds of things have an impact on people's lives. And so, understanding your feelings, mourning the losses that go along with trauma, doing the work of, taking emotional risks in your life, those are the things people do need to do to recover. Forgiveness may or may not be part of that.
Mm-hmm. So, it's such an interesting issue. And when I came across that section in your book on forgiveness, I was so happy, because it's exactly in alignment with what I believe as well, that, if you're carrying a terrible pain because of something that has been done to you or your family, and nobody's asking for your forgiveness, nobody's coming to you and saying, I realize deeply and fully that I have injured you, and I'm so sorry for what I may have done to hurt you, and I recognize what it was that I did, and they are able to express what it is that they have done and take ownership for it in a way that is sufficient for you, and nobody can tell you what that is, so it has to be sufficient for you, then, this whole notion of you have to forgive in order to heal, I absolutely do not agree with that. I think you need to find ways to live your life in a meaningful way in order to heal. But, whether it's necessary for you to so-called forgive a person who has injured you, no, you need to move away from from hatred or kind of pain or anger that you're holding within inside of yourself, because that just injures you. Right. But this idea of forgiveness, it's like, I don't know that I don't think it really answers what it's meant to answer. And so many people advocate this forgiveness rule that I'm glad that we're talking about the issue, because I hope it will unburden somebody who might have this notion. We've also got an email from Mike, and he just says, I just tuned in. Is there any contact information for your guest? Yes, this is Dr. Robert T. Muller. And maybe, Robert, you could just tell, again, the easiest way that people can get in touch with you. And I will just say that we're going into our last, 5 or 6 minutes, and that if you have an email, if you want to share something with us before we finish today, in studio101@gmail.com. And I will just say that if people are interested in the trauma practice, our charity, and they do want to, or they're thinking about putting in a donation to support these kinds of conversations, raising awareness about mood, mind, health, and reducing stigma, then you can make donations at traumapractice.org, and we're happy for any amounts at all. We're working on developing the infrastructure and starting our programs and making a difference. So maybe, Robert, if you could just help people to know how to get in touch with you.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So if you Google my full name, spelled Robert T. Muller, is spelled Muller, and you go to my Amazon author page, you can find my books, Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, and Trauma and the Avoidant Client. So those are my 2 books. You can also find me by Googling my name, Robert T. Muller, YouTube. You'll find 9 or so videos there that are various kinds of podcasts and interviews that I've done, as well as there are several more that are going to be going up there over the next couple months. And in addition, you can also go to my blog. It's a Psychology Today blog called Talking About Trauma. So if you type Talking About Trauma and my full name again, then you'll get to my blog, and then you'll also be able to get some more information and materials, short articles, as well as other really interesting things about trauma.
Super, fabulous. So one last email, and this is from Clyde, and it is, your show today has no doubt awakened this issue in our society that so many trauma victims have gone through. A lot of people need external help by professionals to start the healing process. Your show lets people know that there is in fact help out there, but more needs to be done to let the public know that there is help. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for sending that email, and it's really good to know, and I'm really glad that we are having this conversation. Robert, I want to really end with one more question really for you, and this references really a focus in doing trauma work that I think we both really adhere to, and I know, thank you, by the way, for the reference in your book to the reference to my book, that you wrote about a triphasic or a phase-oriented approach to trauma care. And, I think that this is absolutely crucial, and people, who are looking for care after they've experienced something difficult, I think it's good for them to understand that taking a triphasic approach is is very, very important. And, you know, I would like to hand that over to you because you speak well about it.
Yeah, for sure. So it's kind of like what I said before about pacing, that the process of therapy really and the process of recovery has to happen in stages, or at least it can't happen all at once. You know, you can't eat a meal all at once, right? I mean, it has to happen over a little bit of time. I mean, you have to pace things out, and it can be very overwhelming for people otherwise if they try to do, you know, trauma work in a short period of time. It's extremely difficult. So, you know, what we know in trauma therapy research is that the first step is establishing some kind of safety and stabilization strategies. And yeah, you write about this in your book really beautifully and extremely poignantly, that you know, there's safety in the relationship, in the psychotherapy relationship, but there's also this sense that the person needs to find some ways to stabilize their emotions that are so, you know, they're just up and down and very intense, and there's depression, and there are many difficult feelings and feelings of self-blame. All these difficult feelings, people need to feel what we talk about in the trauma literature, grounded, feeling that they can manage their own bodies and their own emotion a little bit better before we start then doing the difficult, painful work of unpacking the meaning of these different trauma stories to them. Then the second phase of therapy is where we start to really talk about some of the difficult things that have happened to, you know, in the person's life, and there's feelings, lots of difficult feelings that come up. And there are various techniques that good trauma therapists use to make that a slow but steady process. Some therapists get afraid of talking about trauma. Well, that's not helpful either, because if you have a painful story to tell and your therapist is like, "Oh, I can't deal with it," then, well, you know, listen, you're not being heard. You're not, you know, your story is not being listened to, and you're not able to deal with it yourself if your therapist can't deal with it. So it requires a therapist-client relationship where they actually go in there and wrestle with this painful history. And then the third stage of therapy is where people do, you know, various things like reconnect with other, you know, things, parts of themselves that they hadn't, you know, that they hadn't experienced in a long time. I used to do this, I used to do that. What happened to that? Kind of finding ways to reconnect to aspects of your social life, your relationship life, your, you know, throughout, exercise is very important. Very often people have trouble connecting to their bodies, connecting to sexuality. That's often a difficult thing, but something that we, you know, once the difficult, you know, in a third stage of therapy, very often I work with people around, hey, what happened to your sexuality in this whole process of trauma? And so we try to help the person find a way to reconnect to that. So that's the phase-based way of working, or stage-based way of working with people in trauma.
Fantastic. I'm really glad that you've been on the show today. We're going to stop really shortly, and I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today, and I am going to be back next month, and I'm going to be talking about holiday stress with Dr. John King, who has his own very important story of growth and recovery, also coming from a very seriously distressed history in his family of origin. And Dr. Robert T. Muller has been our guest today, and I am really glad we had this hour together, Robert, and I want to thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. Thank you. It was such a pleasure.
It really was lovely to hear your thoughts, and you know, something interesting about, you know, when you actually get to hear somebody's spoken word about the things they have written, it can be so enriching. So thank you so much, and I just want to appreciate the work that you're doing.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So I think we've got Gary, who's going to say goodbye to everybody with our extra, and have a great month, and see you in December, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with your host, psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Baranowsky, right here on Reality Radio 101.